The stars bore witness to her servitude. For centuries, Zayara had lived in chains, bound not by iron or steel but by something far crueler, an ancient oath, forged in blood and magic, tying her will to Emperor Zorvath, the ruler of the Kaver Dominion. She was his executioner, his war machine, his invincible weapon against any who dared to defy his reign. Planets crumbled at her command. Rebellions were silenced beneath the weight of her blade. She had long since ceased counting the number of lives she had taken. To do so would be meaningless. Yet no amount of destruction could erase the truth buried deep within her. Zayara was not free. And for a being as powerful as she was, that truth was a torment that never ceased. She stood now aboard the bridge of the dreadnought Void Reaver, her piercing silver eyes fixed on the vast nebula beyond the viewport. The eerie green glow of the ship's control panels illuminated her dark armor, which clung to her like a second skin, both a tool of war and a symbol of her servitude. At her back, she could feel the ever-present weight of Zorvath's power, a pulsing chain around her soul, keeping her tethered to his will. "You seem restless, my executioner." His voice was a slow, insidious whisper, but it carried throughout the bridge as if it had been spoken directly into the minds of all present. Zayara turned and faced him, her expression unreadable. Zorvath lounged upon his throne of obsidian, and gold, his elongated features twisting into a smirk. His eyes, black pits filled with swirling stardust, gleamed with amusement. "I am ever at your service, my emperor," Zayara replied, bowing her head. The words came automatically, as they always did. Zorvath chuckled, a sound that slithered over her skin like 1,000 writhing serpents. "Of course you are. And soon you will prove your loyalty again." He gestured with one skeletal hand, and a hollow projection flickered to life before her. It displayed a small, rugged planet, one of the outer colonies on the edge of his dominion. A resistance had formed there, a fledgling rebellion that dared to defy his rule. A familiar scenario. "Destroy them," Zorvath commanded. Zayara inclined her head in acknowledgement. "It will be done." But as she turned to leave, Zorvath spoke again, his voice sharper now. "There is one among them, a human, leading the insurgents." The projection shifted, displaying a man with dark hair, striking green eyes, and a defiance set to his jaw. He was unremarkable by many standards, merely another rebel leader destined to fall beneath her blade. Yet, Zorvath's next words made her pause. "He calls himself Elias Vance. He speaks of freedom, of hope. Dangerous things. Kill him first and let the others watch as their hope dies with him." The chain around her soul tightened. She felt it constrict, forcing obedience. And so, as she had done for centuries, Zayara obeyed. The descent onto the planet was swift and precise. The Void Reaver hovered in the upper atmosphere while her personal strike team deployed in dropships. Zayara did not need an escort, but Zorvath always sent one. Perhaps he feared what she would do if she was left unguarded. The rebel stronghold was hidden within the jagged mountains of this cold, barren world. Zayara approached it without fear, her dark armor reflecting the pale light of the planet's distant sun. The first sentry saw her too late. She moved like a wraith, cutting them down with ruthless efficiency. No screams, no alarms, just death. By the time she entered the stronghold's central chamber, the rebels were already scrambling to defend themselves. They were armed, desperate, but ultimately powerless. She could kill them all in moments. And then she saw him. Elias. Vance stood at the center of the room, his blaster raised. He did not fire, he did not speak. He simply stared at her, his green eyes filled with something she did not expect. Understanding. "You're Zayara," he said at last. She did not answer. "I've heard the stories," Elias continued. "The Emperor's deadliest weapon, his immortal enforcer. You've killed thousands, haven't you?" Zayara stepped forward, blade in hand. "Do not waste your final moments with words." But Elias did not flinch. Instead, he lowered his weapon. The other rebels gasped in shock, but he ignored them. "You're a prisoner," he said quietly. Her grip on the blade tightened. Maybe once you believed in his cause, Elias continued. Maybe you thought it was the right path. But that's not why you're here now, is it? You're here because he commands it. Because he owns you. Silence. The word came out colder than the wind outside. Elias took a step closer. Zorvath's chains aren't unbreakable. If they were, he wouldn't fear you. But he does, doesn't he? Sayara felt a strange sensation, a flicker of something buried deep, something she had long forgotten. Doubt. She raised her blade. Elias did not move. Kill me, he said, his voice steady. Or choose something else. For the first time in centuries, Sayara hesitated, and in that moment, the alarms blared. Reinforcements had arrived. She could hear the screams outside as Zorvath's soldiers stormed the stronghold. The rebels scrambled for cover, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. If she did nothing, they would all die. She had always done nothing. But as Elias met her gaze, unafraid, something within her shattered. Sayara turned, her blade flashing, and for the first time, she did not strike down rebels. Instead, she cut through the soldiers who had come to slaughter them. She did not know what this choice meant. She only knew that for the first time in her eternal servitude, she had chosen for herself. The moment she struck down the first soldier, Sayara felt something she had not felt in centuries, uncertainty. The chains of her servitude had not shattered, but they trembled. She had disobeyed. Zorvath's hold on her had not been broken, but it had been defied. The rebels did not understand what was happening, not at first. To them, she had been a specter of death, a nightmare given form. And now, she stood between them and their executioners, blade dripping with the blood of those she had once called allies. Elias was the first to act. Move! Regroup at the eastern passage, he barked, and the rebels, though stunned, obeyed. Sayara did not look at him. She did not need to. Her instincts, honed over centuries of war, guided her through the chaos. She moved like a shadow, cutting through the ranks of Zorvath's forces with ruthless precision. Blades clashed, energy bolts seared through the air, but none found their mark on her. She was a force of nature, unstoppable, untouchable, and yet for the first time she did not fight for the Empire, she fought for herself. The battle did not last long. Zorvath's troops, expecting a simple purge, had not anticipated facing their own executioner. Those who did not fall fled, their loyalty to the Empire crumbling in the face of a force they could not hope to match. The stronghold stood, battered but not broken. The rebels, breathing heavily, stared at Sayara as if seeing her for the first time. You saved us, one of them muttered, disbelief thick in their voice. Elias stepped forward. Unlike the others, his gaze was not filled with fear. It was something else, curiosity perhaps, or something deeper. You hesitated, he said, studying her. Back in the hall, before the fighting started. Sayara remained silent. The truth sat bitter on her tongue. He took another step closer. Why? She met his gaze. I do not know. It was not a lie. She had killed countless rebels before, slaughtered thousands without hesitation. Why had she faltered now? Why? Had she turned her blade against those she once fought beside? The chains around her soul remained. She could still feel them, the pull of Zorvath's will. He had not lost his grip on her. Not yet. But something had changed. Elias seemed to sense it. He exhaled, nodding slightly. You don't have to go back, he said. Sayara stiffened. You don't have to be his weapon anymore, he pressed. You chose to save us. That means you can choose something else. The words unsettled her. A part of her wanted to dismiss them, to claim that she had only acted on instinct, that her actions had no deeper meaning. And yet they echoed in her mind, whispering of possibilities she had never dared to consider. The thought was dangerous. She was dangerous. We must leave, she said abruptly. Elias frowned, but he did not argue. Agreed. The Empire will Send more troops once they realize the first squad failed. We need to disappear before that happens. Ziara turned, scanning the battlefield. Most of the rebel forces were still intact, though some bore wounds from the skirmish. They would not last against the full might of Zorvath's dominion. She had spent centuries hunting those who defied the Empire. Now, she was one of them. The realization settled into her bones, foreign and unwelcome. Still, she followed Elias and his people into the shadows. They moved swiftly through the mountains, avoiding Imperial patrols. Ziara remained at the rear, watching, listening. The rebels were wary of her, but none dared voice their concerns in front of Elias. He was their leader, and for whatever reason, he had accepted her presence. As they reached a hidden cavern where a small transport ship awaited, Elias finally addressed her. "Are you coming with us?" Ziara hesitated. "I have not decided." Elias nodded, as if he expected that answer. "The choice is yours." She studied him, searching for deception. She found none. "You are unusual for a human," she said. He smiled faintly. "And you are unusual for an immortal war machine." She did not smile back. The others began boarding the ship, preparing for departure. Ziara could leave. She could vanish into the stars, disappear into the void, and yet she did not move. Finally, Elias spoke again. "If you want to know what freedom feels like, and stay." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, without a word, she stepped onto the ship. The journey to the rebel fleet was quiet. Ziara remained apart from the others, seated in the shadows of the cargo hold. The whispers did not bother her. She had expected them. They feared her. Resented her. She could not blame them. Elias approached, leaning against the bulkhead. "You don't have to sit here alone." Ziara tilted her head slightly. "I am not one of you." He nodded. "Not yet." She studied him again. "Why do you trust me?" "I don't," he admitted, "but I believe in what I saw back there. You had a choice and you made it. That means something." She looked away. "You do not know what I am." Elias exhaled. "Maybe not. But I know this. Zorvath doesn't own you. Not completely." A silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time, Ziara admitted the truth aloud. "I want to be free." Elias smiled. "Then let's find a way to make that happen." For the first time in centuries, she allowed herself to hope. The rebel fleet drifted in the shadows of a dying star, hidden in the void where Zorvath's reach had yet to grasp. The ships were old and battle-worn, scavenged from forgotten wars, and stolen from Dominion supply lines. They were a force held together by desperation and defiance. Ziara stood at the edge of the command deck, staring out at the darkness beyond the viewport. It had been days since she had turned against Zorvath's forces, since she had chosen, however uncertainly, to follow Elias and his rebels. But her chains still remained. She could feel them, pulsing at the edges of her mind like a wound that refused to close. Zorvath had not severed his hold on her. He was waiting, watching, and he was coming. Behind her, the hushed voices of the rebel officers barely registered in her mind. They feared her still, though they did their best to hide. It only Elias spoke to her without hesitation. "Scouting reports came back," he said, stepping beside her. "Dominion ships are searching the sector. We don't have long before they find us." Ziara did not turn. "He already knows where we are." Elias frowned. "How?" She met his gaze. "Because I am still bound to him." Silence. Elias studied her, searching her face for any sign of deception. He would find none. "So he can track you," he said at last. She nodded. Elias exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "That explains why he hasn't sent a full fleet yet. He doesn't need to. He's waiting for the right moment." Ziara said nothing. She had spent centuries hunting those who defied Zorvath's rule. She knew his tactics. He would strike when they were at their weakest. He would make her watch as he tore this rebellion apart, and then he would drag her back into servitude, unless she stopped him first. Elias seemed to sense her thoughts. There's a way to break the bond, isn't there? Ciara hesitated. I do not know. Another half-truth. She had never tried to sever Zorvath's control before. She had never dared to. But now, for the first time, she wanted to try. Elias leaned against the console beside her. We have a plan, he said. It's risky, but it's our best shot. We go on the offensive. If we let Zorvath control the battlefield, we're already dead. Ciara arched a brow. You would challenge the most powerful ruler in the galaxy? Elias grinned, though there was steel behind it. You've already done the impossible once. Why stop now? She did not answer, but deep inside something in her stirred. Perhaps she was not as powerless as she had once believed. The plan was simple, reckless, a direct assault on Zorvath's flagship, the Void Reaver. It was madness. No rebel fleet had ever dared attack the Dominion head-on. Zorvath's forces were vast, his ship a fortress of impenetrable defenses. But Elias knew the truth. They could not run forever. If they were to break Zorvath's grip on the galaxy, they had to strike at its heart, and Ciara was the key. She had walked the halls of the Void Reaver more times than she could count. She knew its defenses, its weaknesses. If they could breach its outer perimeter, she could lead them straight to Zorvath himself. But there was one problem. He still controls me, Ciara said as she stood in the war room, surrounded by rebel leaders. If he wills it, I will turn my blade against you. The rebels exchanged wary glances. None of them had forgotten what she was, what she could still become. Elias, however, remained steady. Then we break his hold before he has the chance. Ciara tilted her head slightly. And how do you intend to do that? Elias turned to one of the rebels, a wiry woman named Drayan, who had once been a Dominion scientist before defecting. She stepped forward, adjusting the datapad in her hands. Zorvath's bond over you is ancient magic, correct? Ciara nodded. Drayan exhaled. I've been studying Dominion records for years. There's a way to sever a binding like yours, but it won't be easy. Elias crossed his arms. What do we have to do? Drayan hesitated before answering. You have to kill him. Silence fell over the room. Ciara's expression did not change. That is easier said than done. Drayan nodded. He's tied to you through his will. As long as he lives, his control remains absolute. But if you kill him with your own hands, the bond should break. Elias looked at Ciara. Then that's what we'll do. For a long moment, Ciara said nothing. Then slowly she nodded. It was time to end this. The assault began at the edge of a dying star. The rebel fleet emerged from the darkness, engines burning bright as they launched their attack. Fighters swarmed, like hornets, engaging Dominion forces in a deadly dance of fire and steel. The Void Reaver loomed ahead, a monolith of destruction, its cannons already tearing into the rebel ships. But Ciara did not hesitate. She moved through the chaos with Elias and his strike team, cutting a path toward the flagship's core. The corridors of the Void Reaver were familiar yet alien. She had walked them as a servant, as a weapon. Now she walked them as something else. As they neared the throne room, the pull of Zorvath's will grew stronger. Come back to me, his voice whispered in her mind. You cannot escape what you are. Ciara staggered. The chains around her soul burned, tightening like a noose. Elias caught her. Stay with me. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to move. They reached the doors of the throne room. Beyond them, Zorvath waited. The doors slid open, revealing the Tyrant seated upon his obsidian throne. He smiled. My wayward blade returns. Ciara raised her sword. Zorvath did not move. He did not need to. His power crashed over her like a tidal wave, dragging her down into the abyss of his will. Kneel. Her body obeyed before her mind could resist. Thurike. Chains tightened, pulling her to the floor. Pain lanced through her skull. No, not this time. Ziara gritted her teeth, fighting against the command, against the centuries of obedience carved into her very being. She could hear Elias shouting, hear the battle raging around her. But none of it mattered. Only one thing mattered. She was not a weapon. She was not his. With a cry, she broke free of the chain's grip, launching herself forward. Zorvath's eyes widened in surprise. For the first time in centuries, she struck of her own free will. Her blade met his flesh. Zorvath roared in fury as the steel plunged into his chest. His body twisted, his form flickering between dimensions as the magic that bound him unraveled. The throne room trembled. The ship groaned. The empire shattered. Ciara watched as Zorvath crumbled, his form dissolving into the void. And then the chains around her soul broke. She was free. Zorvath's death was not quiet. The moment Ziara's blade pierced his form, the air itself trembled. His body convulsed, shifting between solid and incorporeal, his essence unraveling like a fraying thread in the cosmic fabric. He let out a final, wordless scream, not of pain but of rage, of disbelief that his dominion could be undone. The throne room quaked. The obsidian pillars cracked, fissures of crimson light bleeding from them as the magic that sustained his power collapsed. The chains that had bound Ziara for centuries, unseen, unbreakable, snapped. She felt them disintegrate, felt the weight of them vanish, leaving her light. She gasped. For the first time in her endless existence, she could breathe freely. Zorvath's body disintegrated into black dust, swept away by the unnatural wind that howled through the collapsing chamber. His throne, once an indestructible monolith, crumbled into rubble. The emperor of the Kevar dominion was dead, and she had killed him. Ziara! She barely registered Elias's voice. The world around her was unraveling. With Zorvath's death, the Void Reaver, a ship intertwined with his very being, was coming apart at the seams. The floor beneath them cracked as emergency sirens blared, red lights flickering. Fires raged in the corners of the chamber, metal groaning under the strain of the ship's imminent destruction. Elias grabbed her arm. "We have to move." For a moment, she did not respond. She was still processing the absence of something that had always been there. The ever-present pull of Zorvath's will, the force that had controlled her every action, was gone. She was free. She looked at Elias. His green eyes were filled with urgency, but also something else. Something that had been there since the beginning. Belief. "Ziara," he said again, softer this time. She blinked once. Then she moved. They ran through the collapsing corridors of the Void Reaver, the ship coming undone around them. The rebel strike team fought their way back to the hangar, dodging falling debris and enemy soldiers who had been left leaderless, lost without their master. Some fought with desperation, while others simply fled, scrambling for escape pods. Ziara cut through those who stood in their way without hesitation, her movements sharper, swifter than ever before. She had thought that without Zorvath's magic she might feel weaker, but the opposite was true. For the first time, she was not fighting under the weight of control, she was fighting as herself. They reached the hangar just as the last rebel gunship was preparing to depart. The ship's side ramp was already closing. "Go! Go!" one of the rebels shouted. Elias pushed Ziara forward. "Jump!" She did. She landed lightly on the ramp as the gunship lifted off, engines roaring. Elias landed beside her a second later, gripping the rail to steady himself as the ship veered away from the crumbling dreadnought. The Void Reaver, once a symbol of terror across the stars, was falling. Explosions rippled across its surface as its core destabilized. The rebels' fleet was already retreating, escaping into the void before the ship's destruction could consume them. Ziara stood at the open hatch, watching as the flagship of the Dominion burned. Zorvath was gone. His empire would soon follow, and she was no longer his blade. The rebel fleet regrouped in deep space, far from Dominion-controlled territories. The moment they landed aboard the flagship Solace, a roar of celebration erupted among the rebels. Zorvath's death was the first true victory they had ever achieved. Elias was swarmed by his people, cheers and laughter filling the air. They were survivors who had fought against impossible odds, and for the first time they had won. But Ziara remained apart. She stood at the edge of the hangar, watching. The weight in her chest was unfamiliar. She had spent centuries as a servant of the Empire. Now she had no master. What was she supposed to do next? Elias approached, his expression softer than before. "You did it," he said. She turned to him. "We did it." A small smile touched his lips. "So what happens now?" Ziara hesitated. "I do not know." The admission felt strange. For centuries, her path had always been decided for her. Every order, every battle, every life she had taken, it had all been dictated by someone else's will. Now, for the first time, the choice was hers. Elias studied her, then leaned against the railing beside her. "You don't have to decide. Right now," she frowned. "You would have me stay?" He gave a small shrug. "If you want to." The idea wasn't foreign. She had spent lifetimes being feared, hated. She had never been wanted. Elias seemed to sense her thoughts. "You chose to save us. That means something." She met his gaze. "I am still what I was." "A weapon?" he asked. She hesitated. Elias shook his head. "No, you were a weapon. Now, you get to be something else." She turned away, staring into the endless stars beyond the viewport. Something else. She had spent centuries believing she was nothing more than a blade in someone else's hand. But now, standing here, surrounded by people who had once feared her and now looked at her with something almost like hope, perhaps she could be something more. For the first time in her endless existence, Ziara allowed herself to wonder what it would mean to live. And for the first time, she wanted to find out. Epilogue. The news spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The Emperor was dead. The Dominion was fracturing. Some of Zorvath's warlords still held on to power, but without his presence, their grip was slipping. Rebellions erupted on every occupied world. And for the first time in centuries, the people believed they could be free. At the heart of it all was the woman who had once been the Empire's deadliest weapon. Whispers of Ziara's betrayal carried across the stars. Some called her a traitor, others a savior. She did not know what she was, but she knew she was free, and that was enough. For now.